Florida Guardianships. Who shall live and who shall die? In the Jewish religion, there is liturgy on the high holy days that asks the timeless question, who shall live and who shall die? How many will pass from the earth? Who will live and who will die? Who will die after a long life and who before his time? Who by water and who by fire? Who by sword and who by beast? Who by famine and who by thirst? Just as we ask of Florida life and death guardianships, who shall live and who shall die and why? Who by abuse and who by neglect? Who by starvation and who by isolation? Who by sepsis and who by gangrene? Who by violence and who by silence? Who by heat and who by cold? Who by broken heart and who by malnutrition? Who by infection and who by abandonment? Who by fear and who by loneliness? Who by pills and who by plague? Who by force and who by accident? Who by malaise and who by malfeasance? Who today and who tomorrow? Who alone and who forgotten? Who defenseless and who protesting? Who unconscious and who agitated? Who without hydration and who without nutrition? Who with family and who alone? Who fearful and who lonesome? Who listless and who restless? Who unfed and who undressed? Who feverish and who freezing? Who threatened and who silenced? Who overdosed and who despondent? Who anonymous and who famous? Who now and who later? Why now? Why later? In 1987, Florida Congressman and Chairman Claude Pepper opened a congressional hearing entitled Abuses in Guardianship of the Elderly and Infirm, a National Disgrace. And that is exactly where we are now, a national disgrace. From 1987 through 2022, a national disgrace. Claude Pepper stated on the record for all to know and see, the typical ward has fewer rights than the typical convicted felon. By appointing a guardian, the court entrusts to someone else the power to choose where they will live, what medical treatment they will get, and in rare cases, when they will die. It is in one short sentence the most punitive civil penalty that can be leveled against an American citizen, except for the death penalty. October is proclaimed in Florida as Guardianship Awareness Month. But in the hearts and lives of tens of thousands of Florida state wards and their families, the rest of them, October is more appropriately named Guardianship Beware Month. In the case of Alice Yanis Cabbage of Bradenton, Florida, Her backbone literally was broken at a nursing home demanded to be Alice's resident by longtime professional guardian Anne Ridings. Ridings never ordered immediate medical care for her ward. Alice's biggest fear came true when her guardian left her for months and months in nursing homes, rather than the beautiful home of her daughter, where she had lived a happy, healthy life for many years. After relentless requests to Judge Dino Economou for the compassionate release of Alice from her COVID-infested nursing home to return her to her family, Alice was only released after dying from COVID for her trip to heaven. Long before Alice's case, Halcats, also in Manatee County, was in professional guardianship. His crimes were simple. He was an elderly Holocaust survivor, and the professional guardians forcibly removed Halcats from his condo, involuntarily restricted him to an abusive nursing home, and eventually seized his condominium. He went into guardianship in September 2018, fully verbal and fully mobile. He left labeled imminent death 2 months later. He was completely isolated from his family for weeks. He suffered PTSD attacks, flashbacks, back to the Holocaust. Very, very, very painful flashbacks. Back to the home. At one point in time, as we see in the photo, Halcats confronted his guardian, Ashley Butler, because in his mind, she was a Nazi. She would not let him live in his home. She would not let him live with his family. In fact, she fought in court fiercely so that Al would never be able to see his family. Another Holocaust survivor, Marie Winkelmann, in Sarasota, right next door to Manatee County, to Bradenton, Florida. Marie Winkelmann is a very accomplished artist, as you can see her beautiful paintings. She was living very successfully and happily until she was taken into guardianship. She was a sparkling author, painter, and world traveler who had witnessed her own family burning alive in the Warsaw Ghetto. Nonetheless, once Chief Judge Charles Williams decided that, and court ordered that, Marie Winkelmann, as a Jew, as a Holocaust survivor, against her will and her religious conviction, was to be cremated upon her death. When a friend offered in writing to pay for a proper Jewish burial and funeral for Marie Winkelmann, Judge Williams said no, violating Marie's religious rights. Another Jew in professional guardianship in Florida has been denied the right to attend synagogue services, the right to have kosher food, and the right to a proper Jewish burial and funeral. Jan Gardner was eventually released from guardianship. Because she was never incapacitated. Never incapacitated. But by the time she was released, she had lost her home, virtually all of her valuable worldly possessions, and her sense of dignity. Even judges can end up in guardianship, as did Clayton Garst Jr., who had become so fabulously wealthy that his 80-acre buffalo and beef ranch attracted guardianship attention. During his guardianship, his precious wife, Bunny, that you see in the photograph, was eliminated from his life. The 6-year-old dog that he loved so much, and 9 of his beloved buffalo, mysteriously died. Clayton was the son of early Manatee County settlers. He was a veteran who lived with his wife for over 30 years until his guardianship. He eventually was released. After much, much anguish and suffering and loss of assets that were seized in the guardianship. Now, to the opposite end of the spectrum of luxury is the case of Mary Sparr, whose beloved cat was left uncared for, unattended unattended and unfed for many weeks under the control of guardian and writings. Although the Manatee County Sheriff's Department rightly documented this felony crime as, quote, torture animal with intent, end quote, and Writings was never arrested, indicted, or prosecuted and remained Mary's guardian, Mary Sparr's guardian for years until her miserable death in guardianship. She also, Anne Writings, remained guardian of Alice Yanis Cabbage until her miserable death. She remained guardian of Robert Battles, who died in Anne Writings' care. And she remains guardian of Marilyn Battles, who spends her lonely life isolated in a nursing home. Anne Writings has committed cruelty to animals, according to the Manatee County Sheriff's Department, but there are no consequences. According to Mary Sparr's family, my mother lost her left eye to neglected infection, not acknowledged by the court. This last visit left eyelids shut, right side infected. Help my mother. Another truly tragic case. Of a husband and wife, pictured here, on their very, very last vacation together and virtually their last time together. Hershel Harbor and his wife, Becky, were in love for 31 years. And I dare say still are. Hershel's autopsy by a Florida renowned autopsy specialist showed that Hershel Harbor, in the care and control of the state of Florida, died from 4, level 4 bed sores down to the bone. Hershel's guardian requested a do not resuscitate order and obtained it, despite his family's opposition. Becky Harbor, wife of 31 years of loving marriage, had to fight the state of Florida for the right to bury her own husband in a family plot that had been used for generations to bury Hershel's ancestors. She had to fight the religious convictions. May this poor man rest in peace. He was forcibly separated by the state of Florida from his wife for 7 months until he died a miserable, painful, horrifying death alone. Right now, in Suwannee County, Florida, which looks like a very picturesque small town, only about 7,000 people. But Richard Herring has lived a life of pain, suffering, torture, because he's in isolation for years, nearly 1/2 decade. Richard Herring, a veteran, has spent thousands of days forcibly separated from the wife who adores him and has been fighting the state of Florida continuously to have the right to care for and be with and comfort and give solace to her husband. A veteran. Is this what the state of Florida does to our veterans? He doesn't even have a telephone. He was in the Navy in Vietnam, in charge of weapons. He was exposed to Agent Orange and currently has multiple growths. Faye Herring has been harassed for years as she opposes the abuse and violence against her husband. Her husband in the nursing home was beaten by a much larger roommate in guardianship when he could be home with the wife who loves him. Another Florida veteran, Air Force, Korean War veteran, died of gangrene from medical neglect in Manatee County Guardianship. Lying in bed, isolated for years. What is typical about this case is that our Florida wards have no off-site excursions other than doctor visits, hospital stays, hospice care, no afternoon luncheons at restaurants, no church or synagogue services, no holiday gatherings with their family, no special occasions to celebrate. Their long days are dark, without hope, and these veteran families, and a large percentage of our Florida wards are veterans and their families. The physical and mental health of these veterans and other elders deteriorate exponentially guardianship, causing premature deaths, pain, and suffering due to extreme prolonged sensory deprivation and denial of physical exercise. Where are there any consequences to the professional guardians for storing our veterans in beds without medical help and without hope until they pass out of this world? Gangrene is a horrible death sentence. Robert Battles and his wife both were under the control of professional guardian Anne Writing, who did not tell Marilyn where her husband was and his cause of death. And Writings forcibly separated Marilyn and Robert Battles after 69 years of marriage. Forcible separations, breaking a contract made in a church with God to love, honor, and obey until death do us part. But many of our Lord's families will never see them again, including their own wives. Robert Battles was a highly successful farmer in Mount Victory, Ohio, a real estate agent, and the owner of a nursery for 35 years, actively involved in numerous community service organizations, yet he died in an unknown place from an unknown cause, forcibly separated from his wife after their 69th wedding anniversary. Marilyn Battles lost Robert, her husband. She lost her grandson. She lost her doting daughter, all during the time of her guardianship under the control of Anne Writings, and Marilyn Battles has never once been allowed to attend the funeral of the people that she loves the most. Her husband, her grandson, who lived with her until guardianship, of course, and her daughter. Because in guardianship, your guardian can decide. You can't even know when your loved one has passed away. You cannot even know why he passed away, and you cannot attend a funeral. Now here's Julia Guggens. This spunky woman was one of the very early female pilots. Very accomplished, and when she lost her husband and with no children, her neighbors on Lido Beach which is one of the most very beautiful beaches in all of Florida, in Sarasota County. Her neighbors offered to help her out as durable powers of attorney and trustees, but they took advantage of her, which she reported to her attorney, Christopher Smith, upon which he, Christopher Smith, filed 3 court petitions against Julia for her to be determined incapacitated and put into involuntary guardianship. And her guardian was Ann Ridings. Ann Ridings, before Judge Charles Williams, successfully sought to have the same neighbors who exploited Julia reinstated as her durable powers of attorney and trustees. Despite the fact that Julia's attorney had notified Judge Williams of the exploitation by these same neighbors. So Julia lost her Lido Beach home on the beach where she had lived for decades. She lost all of her possessions and she lost her home in Sarasota as well and was placed into a nursing home miles away from anything familiar to her. In her room, which I saw, was a bed, a tiny, tiny table, and a couple of chairs. That's what she was afforded after living a very, very successful life as a female pilot. Now being forced to live out her life in guardianship, nursing home isolation against her will. The case of Omar Rojas is heart-wrenching. Omar's Hispanic mother adores him. You can see that in the picture, and vice versa. He adores her. But the vast majority of the time, Omar is forcibly separated from his mom, and even though she took care of him all of his life, the state of Florida took him out of her care. Early on, when Omar's guardian removed him from school, she refused to tell his pleading parents for weeks where he was taken. So the guardians just go into the schools sometimes and take these children, and the parents do not know where they are. Every account I have read about this mother's care of her son is laudatory. But she's not allowed to take care of her son. Per the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Indeed, Omar's treatment in Florida guardianship is, quote, cruel, inhuman, and degrading, end quote, as he suffers loneliness, anxiety, grounds of abandonment forcibly separated from his mother and his father. Another young person in guardianship, Megan Smoot. In her mid-20s, had suffered the loss of her beloved mother in a plane accident, precipitating drug abuse. Megan's drug abuse. As her guardianship exacerbated her situation, she wrote to her Broward County judge. In recovery, communication is vital and essential. A lack of outside communication and isolation, I don't believe it's good for my mental health or continued growth. So we isolate teenagers like Omar, young adults like Megan, we isolate them. We don't even do that to habitual violent criminals. But we do that to innocent young people. According to an examiner, Megan's rights should have been partially restored. But her guardian, Marie Bambi Nicolacus Williams, differed with that. Bambi resigned from Maryland's case only after Bambi was exposed for lying on guardianship records. Megan was then transferred to a large guardianship corporation where she relapsed under the stress of her continuing guardianship. And in June 2021, just days after Brittney Spears' public protests against her own guardianship, Megan's judge finally liberated Megan from guardianship. Too late, for she died soon thereafter of unknown causes. When Florida's Guardianship Office, OPPG, documented that Bambi had falsified guardian records under penalty of perjury, Bambi's sole consequence was 3 hours of training on guardianship ethics, while her young and beautiful former ward lost the rest of her lifetime. Not all people in guardianship are young and beautiful. Albert Hogue was about to be spending the rest of his lifetime as a ward of the state of Florida. But miraculously, Albert, pictured here with his daughter Hillary, is living a real family life. Praise God. A real family life with his daughter and grandsons. grandsons. Most of our wards never get to see their grandchildren again. Hillary says her father never had the opportunity to defend himself, but was instead placed under an emergency temporary guardianship. Albert Hogue is one of very, very few Florida elders who ever leave guardianship once there is an ETG, an emergency temporary guardianship. Another leader in the state of Florida, probably the most famous one across the United States and even internationally, is Dr. Sam Sugar, who is not only a physician of note, but an author, a film producer, and a tireless advocate for wards. Dr. Sam Sugar, pictured here with his beautiful wife, lost millions of dollars and endless hours fighting to free his mother-in-law from guardianship. His mother-in-law, Idell Stern, was the wife of a rabbi and an investor who left her a sizable estate valued at $13 million. Before guardianship, Idell's life was ideal. She was vital, friendly, always on the go. Then, according to Dr. Sugar, Idell was forced to be a prisoner. She couldn't play bingo. She couldn't even go and buy an ice cream. Idell, like Halcats and Marie Winkelmann, was a Holocaust survivor. So the state of Florida decided that this innocent Jewish grandmother, Holocaust survivor of Auschwitz, was not allowed to play bingo, was not allowed to go and buy an ice cream without permission from her guardian. This is why Claude Pepper proclaimed in 1987 that our treatment of guardians, our treatment of wards in guardianship by their guardians is more punitive than the treatment of convicted felons. Holocaust survivors like Idell, Halcats, and Marie Winkelmann are ideal for involuntary guardianship because their early lives were shattered by the Nazis. And they just try to live, that many of them are successful. And they begin their lives losing everything, and they end their lives losing everything. They begin their lives losing everything to the Nazis, and they end their lives losing everything guardianships. This poor woman, Debbie Woodward, spent 7.5 years beginning in her early 50s being transformed from a licensed nurse to a fully incapacitated woman with no rights. Now, how does that happen? That you go from being a licensed nurse to a fully incapacitated woman with no rights. I will tell you how that happened. Debbie's trust was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars from her mom's recent death. And Lutheran Services was appointed her guardian. And then Herbert Schimmel, who was also the guardian of Halcats. Schimmel, in 3 years' time, was paid well over $40,000, and this was years and years ago, and consistently insisted that none of Debbie's rights should be restored to her. So her guardian was fighting and fighting against her restoration of rights for years. But suddenly, in 2005, after nearly all of Debbie's trust had been devoured, all of Debbie's rights were restored. So she went from fully capacitated to fully incapacitated to fully capacitated again. And Schimmel packed up Debbie's meager belongings in trash bags and deposited her to live in poverty with a friend in a very low-income trailer park on a major Bradenton highway in a very high-crime neighborhood. Schimmel went on years later to commit tax fraud in Halcats' guardianship, leaving Al's estate tens of thousands of dollars in debt to the IRS, and Al's minor heirs bereft of all of their inheritance that Halcats had scrupulously earned for decades for their education. They got nothing from their great-grandfather, whom they adored, and vice versa. In the case of Donald Pete Beatty, we are talking an estate of $100 million. $100 million. Pete was a lifetime farmer and rancher who owned thousands of acres of cornfields here in Central Florida and thousands of heads of cattle. Even before Lucky Pete won Florida's biggest lottery award at the time, which amounted to 20 annual installments of nearly $1 million each. With his vast fortune, Pete donated the entire surgical wing at South Florida Baptist Hospital as the sole financier. But with his entire fortune, Pete died a miserable death, alone, isolated. Again, isolation is torture, New York State has declared isolation as torture. Many different countries around the world and other states of the United States have declared in law that isolation is torture. But we in Florida tortured Pete Beatty. We tortured him. A man who donated an entire surgical wing at a hospital, we tortured him so that he could never even be with the love of his life. Doris, who was forbidden by the guardian by restraining order to visit her 91-year-old dying soulmate, forbidden to visit him. Pete died alone, secreted, isolated from everyone he loved. Marcy Freeman is the child of Cuban refugees to America who sought safety and asylum from socialist persecution, deprivation, and intolerable living conditions. Her mother, Lilia Martinez, found at the end of her life in America, really consisting of 7 years in isolation, where Mrs. Martinez lived inside of a converted garage owned by her grandson in rural Glades County. The state of Florida took a naturalized Cuban refugee to live in a garage. Her daughter, who adored her, Marcy Freeman, struggled for visitations with her mom and was finally, and again, this went on for years. Finally, Marcy was granted to see her mom 2 hours once a week. 2 hours once a week to see her own mother in a garage. Marcy wrote, "Mom continues to sleep alone in a separate room inside the garage with clutter. Mom and I have been put through a legal, emotional, and financial roller coaster ride of years trying to protect Mom. I just dispute the fact that this was a legal roller coaster ride. No, it was entirely illegal. We do not put wards of the state to sleep in cluttered garages. That is not legal. go to the case of Oliver Wilson Bivens Sr. A Texas oil man with a condo in Florida, where he tragically visited for a weekend vacation. A weekend vacation by a Texas oil man, and caught the attention of a social worker. In his guardianship, he was denied his request to return to his Texas home base, where his family's generations were oil pioneers in Amarillo since the 1800s. Oliver's greatest pleasure came from helping others. And his greatest desire was to reunite with the land he loved, liberated from guardianship isolation from his son Julian. Julian's lawsuit against the guardian's attorneys was awarded $16.4 million in damages. Julian said his father was held captive by the attorneys so they could liquidate real estate assets, including a New York City mansion. He said, "I've been fighting to just get him back to Texas. Finally, I got him back there. Finally. 35 days before he passed away." This is Dr. Florenceeckert, who in her 70s earned a doctorate in education and all kinds of high honors. She has been profoundly deaf for about 60 years. Nonetheless, in her 70s, she earned a doctorate in education. She's a very brilliant investor who was worth about $5 million and was put into guardianship during her stay at a hospital for diverticulitis. Rather than effectively treating her for diverticulitis, Florence, with no hearing aids at all, was tested for incapacity. But she couldn't hear the questions. She couldn't hear her own voice. It was in what can be called a done deal guardianship. If you take a highly disabled person and test her for incapacity so that she cannot hear, the question, the only result you could possibly get is incapacity. Now, her guardian, Pam Weiner of Jewish Family Services, did not get Dr. Florenceeckert, also Jewish, did not get her any hearing aids for months, but instead shuffled Florenceeckert from memory facility to memory facility, lockdown to lockdown, and again, unable to hear what was going on around her. She has no children, she has no family involved with her at all. She was falsely imprisoned and exploited, which is still not resolved. She was put into the Baker Act. And now, finally, after her release from guardianship, the Palm Beach Inspector General is investigating her case. Now, the Palm Beach Inspector General serves with Pam Weiner as a fellow director on the board of the Florida State Guardianship Association. And he has recently become the president of the National Guardianship Association. Florence was released from guardianship on March 16, 2020. And nearly 2 years later, with mounds of evidence, there have been no repercussions for Florence's traumatic, prolonged, false imprisonment and gross exploitation. No repercussions to the persons responsible for these traumas and asset seizures, but enormous repercussions to Florenceeckert. Another minority grotesquely abused in guardianship is another educator, like Dr. Florenceeckert, Dr. Lily White, a beautiful Black woman with a loving family who persistently advocated for her in her isolation for years, Lily had none of human rights or civil rights in her involuntary guardianship and isolation, torture, lockdown. From the age of 6 years old Lily had worked all of her life, earning her doctorate in education and reaching the esteemed level of supervisor of instruction for the prestigious Montgomery County, Maryland public schools. An extraordinary achievement in a state where racist violence and prejudice were prevalent. Lily's family, pictured here with Lily, are her sister and the sister's daughter, Lily's niece, Terry Kennedy. They did not know Lily's whereabouts. Lily was forced into a lockdown facility where she died alone, with her family not notified by the guardian for weeks thereafter. Throughout her guardianship, Lily's outstanding minority family, Black family, was callously treated with utter disdain. Lily had no children and died alone, but even elders who have 7 children can meet the same tragic fate in guardianship, as did Richard and Elizabeth Weber. For years, the Weber's daughters and elder advocates reported the Webers living in conditions worse than animals. In June 2016, Beverly Newman reported to numerous agencies as an elder advocate that, quote, Ward Elizabeth Weber is being grossly mistreated through severe isolation, medical neglect, suffering extreme pain due to serious untreated medical problems, which traumatic circumstances have been reported to Judge David French to no avail. 10 days later, Dr. Beverly Newman received a letterhead reply to her formal complaint from the Palm Beach County Inspector General. Quote, unfortunately, your concern does not fall within the purview of this office. Does not fall within the purview of this office when 2 people are being treated worse than animals by the state of Florida? Nearly 2 years after, Mr. Parseram, owner of the abusive facility where the Webers were warehoused, was arrested finally for illegally restraining a patient to her bed and leaving all of the residents alone overnight. Also accused of molesting patients in his care. It was not until a photograph of a 90-year-old woman trapped in her bed was received by law enforcement that poor Elizabeth Weber was allowed to leave her place of guardianship torture. So what happened to her then? It took a photograph. All of the letters and complaints of family and advocates were completely, totally discredited, denied, and decimated. by the officials in charge of guardianship care. So, after the arrest of Parsaram, less than 2 weeks later, Elizabeth was dead. Dead. After being traumatized by her guardian, who moved her to 4 more facilities. Can you imagine an elderly person who has been abused for years, who has lost everything, and her guardian is still her guardian after these revelations and arrests, and she is moved to 4 more facilities, so she just died. After 75 years of marriage and raising 7 children with her husband, Richard, who also died under Parsaram's care, their horrific guardianships ended with the arrest of their nursing home owner in 2018 and the arrest of their guardian in 2020 on 15 charges related to guardianship, money laundering, theft, and exploitation. So the guardian finally gets removed, finally, years later, after both of the Webbers are dead. Now, Richard Webber, a father of 7, was a World War II veteran and a talented professional trumpeter who played with names like Tommy Dorsey and Harry James. He was under constant threats that he would be separated from his wife if he did not obey the orders of Parsaram. And their lives were totally controlled by their guardian, a name that is infamous in Florida, Lynrod Douglas. Lynrod Douglas, who is still awaiting sentencing on 15 charges of stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from his helpless wards, using their life savings to pay off his mortgage and credit cards, to purchase real property, and to buy himself a Mercedes-Benz. From another ward in his care, Richard Leonhardt, Lynrod Douglas stole over $200,000. And from the other wards in his care, he stole hundreds of thousands more, totaling about $420,000. Now, how was this even uncovered? By Richard's son, not by the authorities, not by OPPG, not by Palm Beach County Inspector General. How was this discovered? Richard's son, Larry, kept meticulous financial records on his father's accounts and assets, and found that over $265,000 in CDs were unaccounted for by Douglas. Now, according to Ken Burke, the Pinellas County clerk, quote, "The guardian does the inventory by themselves. There is no check, no person with them." That is an open invitation a red carpet invitation to grand theft, to exploitation. And this is exactly what you got. So Nimrod Douglas omitted entire bank accounts and assets from his inventory, which is exactly what the guardians of Halcats had done. And it's very, very simple. Richard Leonhardt, like Richard Weber, was a World War II veteran who worked hard his whole life until his life and his wife's savings were exploited by a guardian whose crimes were finally punished much too late. Why do our veterans who fought nobly for our country die in Florida Guardianships in needless misery, ending only in death? Willie Burchell was a bubbly, lively man in his 90s. When his wife passed away, he made the mistake, according to the state of Florida, of selling his house to someone for a price that the realtor did not think was sufficient. So the realtor makes sure that Willie gets put into guardianship. The first time I heard Willie, I could not believe that this very, very well-spoken, animated man could ever have been put into guardianship and labeled as incompetent. He was, even according to an ALF executive, not a candidate for a secured unit. And yet, where was he put? Lockdown isolation. How many poor Florida souls are spending their final days and months and years in lockdown isolation torture? How many? We don't know, because no one tells us. And there are very, very concerted efforts to seal forever guardianship records. Thanks to media exposure, Willie's life was saved, and he died a free man. Who had been in senseless isolation and senseless exploitation as a man who first fled Stalin's massacres and then Hitler's barbarism to live in freedom in America. His judge, St. Arnold, boasted, quote, "Professional guardians do a wonderful job. I'm really pleased with them." Now, this young lady was the daughter of Julie of Maurice London. Julie London Ferguson fought for years to be able to take care of her mom, whom she had worked with for years in Maurice's art store. So they were both artists, mother and daughter, working together for years, right off the beach. Maurice had appointed her daughter Julie to be in charge of her advanced directives, and she was nonetheless refused by the guardian to be in charge of her mother and to care for her mother. Quote, and like a steel leg trap, the judicial system and our Florida Guardianship program became a hard to navigate maze for a daughter to maintain the rights granted to her by her mother. This was reported in Sarasota County's Milan report. Judge Charles Williams put Lutheran Family Services in charge of Maurice London, whose original wishes were finally honored only after pressure from intense scrutiny by the media and officials. Another very devoted daughter, Kathleen Dunn, wrote about her mother, Jacqueline Scott. Quote, she is held captive 30 miles from me. She is not allowed to go anywhere or even have visitors in her room. Phone calls 2 days a week. Large signs placed in the dining room where my mother sat for meals that read, Jacqueline Scott can only have visitors in a public area after lunch and before dinner per her guardian. Can you imagine the humiliation that Jacqueline Scott felt every time she had to eat with large signs in the dining room that she could only have visitors in a public area after lunch and before dinner per her guardian? Gratuitous humiliation. Jacqueline never left the nursing home for 3.5 years, except for trips to the hospital. Quote, she sat all day long in a windowless room with nothing to do, no stimulation, and most times too drugged to do anything. Drugged all day long on Xanax, 3 times per day, and Ambien. I supplied my mother with her clothes, shoes, TV, and toiletries until she died from dehydration and no nourishment, all per the Gardner. Jacqueline was forced into hospice. Then her guardian signed a DNR without family consent or knowledge and had Jacqueline cremated without family consent or knowledge, in direct contradiction to their Catholic religious beliefs. Despite no food and no hydration, Jacqueline struggled to live, humming for an hour before she left her guardianship abyss. Another devoted daughter fought and fought and fought for her mother, Retta Rickow. As reported by the media, Retta's, quote, state-appointed professional guardian has been billing for thousands the entire time, quote, end quote, since Retta passed away. During her guardianship, Retta paid over $50,000 to her guardian and $144,000 to his attorney, with no sign of stopping years after their ward left her. Lynn and Alan Saylor, the daughter and son-in-law of Retta Rickow, have testified before the Florida legislature numerous times, reminding our Sunshine State lawmakers of their duty to protect elders from exploitation by the very professionals registered by the state of Florida to safeguard vulnerable citizens from professional profiteering. Carol Haley is the niece of her Auntie Mame, as she calls her. And Auntie Mame's real name is Marilyn Miller of Clearwater, Florida, who first lost her husband and then her good life following her career as a professional USO entertainer of American troops. This talented, beautiful World War II veteran has been denied all phone calls and visits unless approved by her guardian, which is very, very, very commonplace in Florida guardianships. People with sterling records as responsible citizens of the United States, as veterans, as family members of veterans, are routinely prohibited from receiving phone calls, visits, gifts, cards, communications from their own beloved family members. While in guardianship, they are isolated. They are in isolation, lockdown torture. Which the majority of the world condemns. But it is routine in Florida guardianships. Routine. Carol's lawful power of attorney and health care surrogate designations by her aunt Marilyn Miller were summarily denied by the probate court. Marilyn is entirely secluded from her tiny family in a facility in Largo, Florida, where she is secreted in isolation torture. For isolation is torture by worldwide consensus. Florida's professional guardianships are filled with secrets. There are secret locations where the wards are stored for years away from their families. in lockdowns worse than habitual criminals have, without any access to communicate with the outside world or even their most beloved ones. It is also a secret how many of our wards die of COVID-19 and in which nursing home institutions they die. Another major secret in Florida professional guardianships is the legal right of the guardian to be advised, the legal right by the guardian to advise his or her wards of the restoration of rights process. Tragically, in most cases of restoration of rights by the wards, their own guardians oppose their wards, and the wards must pay not only for their attorneys, but for their guardian's attorneys. For Thomas J. Foster Sr., the cost to change his court-appointed attorney are extraordinary because neither the judge nor Thomas's guardian support his right to substitute counsel of his choice to represent him. So, Thomas J. Foster's case had to go to the Court of Appeals. In a unanimous 2021 appellate decision, the Florida Court of Appeals ruled that the Pinellas County Probate Court had erroneously denied Thomas's motion for substitution of counsel, which causes irreparable harm, quote, and the trial court departed from the essential requirements of the law, end quote. Thus, in Thomas's emergency temporary guardianship, with Florida law expressly on his side, he was forced to spend thousands of dollars for an expensive appeal just to get the Pinellas County Probate Court to obey basic Florida guardianship law. Basic Florida guardianship law. And again, like in other cases, without Thomas Foster's daughter, Sue, he would have had no chance whatsoever to live a normal life or to leave nursing home, lockdown, isolation, torture. A ward walks vertical into a facility and leaps horizontal. This is the reality, with his face covered, and often turns into ashes by order of the court. A fellow congregant of John and Marilyn Hammer described their guardianship. Quote, they're just discarding these people like they're trash. Like they don't have to answer to anybody or have accountability for their actions. For crying out loud, she's a human being, the wife of a Navy veteran. She was loved by not only me, but other people. There's no reason why these things should happen when we live in a country that's supposed to be the best country in the world. These words are eloquent and they are true. Our words are being discarded like they are trash. And the perpetrators act like they don't have to answer to anybody or have accountability for their actions. And why is this happening in the country that's supposed to be the best in the world? Why is this happening in the state that is supposed to be the best in the country? Why? Why is it that infamous professional guardian, Rebecca Fearley, had in her office a trophy collection of human remains cremated at Fearley's command? A trophy collection of human remains cremated by orders of Rebecca Fearley. Who really cares anywhere, quote, about a human being? There's no reason why these things should happen when we live in a country that's supposed to be the best country in the world, end quote. And the best state displays trophies of cremation ashes in broad daylight. In some, who shall live and who shall die? In Florida Guardianships, who shall live and who shall die? And why?